And it's 4:03 on the clock on the wall. Hello, I am Charlie Zelli. This is the Metropolitan Council Committee of the Whole, and welcome this June 7th. I will assume the agenda is approved. It is a full information items. It's great to see Angela and our former employee guest, frequent presenter, Terrence Anderson.
So half and half right now.
And we're also going to get into the and leave time to get an update on the Purple Line because a lot has happened in there. So Craig, thank you for being here. And with that, we want to approve the minutes from May 17th, which are in advance. Is there a motion and a second for the approval of the minutes?
Motion to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion, corrections? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Those minutes are approved. So when we start looking at the, and talking about the equity framework for the regional guide, a lot of this is going to be done in committees as a whole, in formal meetings, committee meetings, and work groups. And I really appreciate everybody's engagement because this is kind of like a big deal for us, and what an honor that this council is going to spend the next kind of really 2 years where we're actually going to issue something. And that doesn't, it only happens every 10 years, so this is our moment for the region. And maybe to kick it off, I know, Robert, you might have wanted to start it off before we introduce, before we give it to Angela. But
Cool, thanks Mr. Chair, and you covered a lot of what I was hoping to cover, and as you said, this will go through pretty much every committee, it'll touch every community in the metro, but just through the Community Development Committee where we've been fortunate to see these guys present on this, it felt like I just want to put a couple things out there, and one is, like you said, I think it's just a privilege and an honor to be trying to figure out how we do this, right? And we're not the only ones in the world trying to figure this out. Pretty much every level of government in the entire country is trying to figure out how to be more equitable. You know, we know the data, and we'll see a little of that tonight, but that shows that we have inequities in our region to a greater extent than pretty much everywhere else in the country, right? And we just need to acknowledge that and be truthful in telling truth about that. And I feel like we're really ready. You know, we've inherited work from the previous council, some of us were on the council before that, all moving in this direction, but it's a hard one, right? It's hard to get your mind around how to fix something like equity in a region from a regional government when it's hard to get your arms around it. But I really want to say thanks to everyone on this council that we are willing to do that and embed hopefully some strategies to address the inequities in our region in our 2050 design guidelines, which I think is just a rare opportunity. And so I'm grateful for that as well. So I just want to say that, and just from the perspective of the CDC chair, that this is something I want to keep surfacing, right? And if we let our eyes off the prize, you know, I think this could get lost and hazy really fast. And so I'm really looking forward to doing this work, and I'm thankful for these guys. And then the other piece I wanted to lift up is just about leadership. And I think the reason we're making so much progress, or we're making progress, is that we're willing to sort of step out, do what we say we do in the region, which is exercise leadership and move the region toward a more equitable direction. But it's important for us to hear about the leadership position that we're taking on this. It's important for the communities and our partners, but it's really important for staff as well. And if we're moving into new territory, that's always risky in units of government like this. And so I just really wanted to make sure that we're making it clear to all of our staff, not just these guys, that this is important. This is a priority for us. So I look forward to this discussion and all the discussions to come.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for your leadership as chair of the Community Development Committee. This is if it has a home, there's where it comes out. So I appreciate your work and the other committee members. Angela, Terrence, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair and council members. It's good to be back in front of you again. It was like good timing, and when you were talking about the anti-displacement work at the last meeting, when Terrence was here, which is why you referred to him as a frequent flyer. So this ties directly into that. So I just want to say thank you for your attention, and thank you, Councilmember Lilligren, for your support. Today, we're just here to talk at a high level about the 2050 planning process. There's been a lot of other presentations about many aspects of the planning, regional planning work that's been going on throughout the council for several years. Yes, the next 2 years, but we've also been working on it for the previous 3 years, and did we ever really stop? I don't know. So what we really want to focus on today, though, is the overall approach to equity for the 2050 Regional Development Guide. And I thank Terrence for being here. I'll introduce him more fully in a few moments. I think everyone is well familiar with the statutory language that requires the Metropolitan Council to develop a comprehensive development guide for the metropolitan area. This is the more descriptive part of statute that kind of outlines what it is we're supposed to be doing to guide for the orderly and economical development of the metro. We talk quite a bit about what that includes: land use, parks and open space, the necessity for airports and highways, transit, etc. But we often forget that middle part of statute, which requires the council to think about the comprehensive development guide, recognizing and encompassing the physical, social, or economic needs of the metropolitan area. And I think as it relates to equity, that is our area of responsibility. And I think that our work on equity is supported by statute. So, thank you. We didn't start just now in talking about equity. In fact, Thrive MSP 2040 has the equity definition that we use right now, as well as measures for a lens, so to speak, for staff to use as they're doing their work too. And we apply this already. And nationally, Thrive MSP 2040 is really looked at as an example because so many regions don't include equity specifically in the same way that Thrive did. And so we're going to build on good work that was done before, take it further, do more, and I think that the region is waiting for us to do this. Thrive does talk about equity and equality. There's a difference. Equity really centers the voices of marginalized and underrepresented people. Equity kind of understands inequities in policies, practices, and cultures that are integral to our history. It understands the historic and current inequities that perpetuate the outcomes, and it seeks to correct unjust patterns. So it's very different from equality, which assumes a level playing field. We do have some of this language on the screen. I won't read it all in Thrive, but there is a masking of equity when we're talking about in terms of equality instead of equity. As we started organizing to develop the project planning for the 2050 Regional Development Guide, a lot of that includes internal organization and getting staff up to speed on the various aspects of that planning process. And we did some training because not everyone is at the same place as it relates to talking about equity. And so we wanted to do our best to kind of start at a level playing field. So we internally as staff gathered together a group of dedicated equity professionals because we are sprinkled across the council in all divisions. We gathered together what we call an internal equity task force to lead these efforts. They're staff from all divisions of the council. We're responsible to a group of leaders in development of policy. That's what they do. I'm part of that team too because I wear many hats. But we are really focusing on the integration of equity in both the process of developing the Regional Development Guide as well as the policies that come from it. The intention is that the Equity Task Force is there not only to lead those efforts but to support the development of other equity initiatives in the Regional Development Guide too. That means that we support staff. So when others have questions about, like, I'm not sure, am I saying this wrong, they can honestly and get some pretty frank feedback from their colleagues. We are responsible for those equity components, including defining equity for our internal use, which we have done. And we're talking now about rolling that out to perhaps an external audience. So as we were working to get staff organized, we're like, this works really well, things are going in the right direction, and we're feeling like we're making progress. And perhaps we should take this to the council to see what their thoughts are about how we're organizing ourselves, and perhaps that would be applicable to the work in the Regional Development Guide externally too. Because as you know, the Regional Development Guide will feed directly into local comprehensive planning, and that is a very wide reach. So if we're providing resources, providing clear definition, providing the right tone and approach, local governments tend to carry that through, even though it may not be a requirement. And so we do a lot of kind of thought through the process and policies as it relates to the equity approach. This is kind of the structure, just to give kind of a big picture of how the internal staff are structured. Our executive co-sponsors are the executive directors or general managers of 3 of our divisions. So Lisa Thompson, general manager of environmental services, Lisa Barajas, who I probably shouldn't forget, and the executive director of community development, and Charles Carlson, who is also an executive director and in the audience of the Metropolitan Transportation, MTS, Metropolitan Transportation Planning Services. Thank you, appreciate that. And so those 3 executive sponsors are the ones that are equally leading the team of policy planners all throughout the council. It's a huge undertaking, and they're trying to do this in a very different way. So we're trying to do this collectively. We're trying to do this as a shared approach, which enforces the shared structure, the shared definitions, shared language, and the shared approach, which includes what we're talking about today and as it relates to equity. And you can see then the integration team are all of the policy team leads, and the equity task force is responsible to the integration team, which is largely made up of managers and supervisors across the council. As we started to figure out how does this work, how it's a huge undertaking, we need some assistance, we need some help, make sure that from a regional perspective we can do this really meaningfully. And I happen to know someone that used to work here, and I gave him a call and said, so what do you think? And so we ended up partnering with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota to help us walk through an equity framework that might be applicable to regional policy. When Terrence was at the council is when the equity framework, what he calls the reparative justice framework, was developed. And so it was done with a regional perspective in mind, and we thought that we could learn a lot from developing an internal staff training series, and we did a series of workshops for all of the staff that are working on policy development throughout the council. We also get resources for implementation of the equity framework, as well as ongoing assistance, like this today. Here's Terrence. He is the Director of Community-Based Programs at the Center for Urban and Regional Development. He hates that I put this picture up. Yeah. So, Terrence, I will turn it over to you, and thank you.
Great. We'll get this
Take
straight. We'll go to the next picture.
We'll come back to this after. So Terrence
We're not changing the picture, but
it is really great to be here, and yes, when Angela calls, I usually, as it's always been since I know her, of course. It's really great to be back here at the council to talk about equity as it relates to the Regional Development Guide. As Angela said, yes, I used to work here. Sometimes I still feel like I do, especially lately. I did develop this framework initially as part of when I was the equity manager for the council. I was absolutely thinking about regional planning. I just happened to move jobs to CURA and brought this framework to CURA, where it's been in practice for the past 5 years of our work. In fact, the presentation that I gave, was it a week ago, 2 weeks ago? It used that framework in developing our plan of action for anti-displacement for the Blue Line extension. So you've even seen sort of this framework in action as it gets to a very practical level in terms of the work that the council does. I do say, I'm a philosophy grad. This presentation is a little bit philosophical, so welcome to my philosophy class. Maybe it's been a while since you've taken your last one. But in some ways, I think what this framework is trying to do is making sure that we're talking about the same thing when we say the word equity. I like to say sometimes equity is sometimes like saying or describing the color blue. And so we're all here to say, I like the color blue, but we sort of realize over time that you might mean dark blue, I might mean light blue. Some people call the color green blue or the color red blue, and are just like, hey, that's not what I really meant, right? And as many people in the room might be as many definitions of equity that there are. So the framework was really developed to try to make sure that we were talking about the same things, or if we meant something different and needed to be added to it, that we're intentional in that conversation in and of itself. So I certainly think that this framework covers a lot of different things, and we'll sort of go through that, of course. I'll sort of walk into the background of what's there, then of course into the framework itself. But I hope what each of you hear from this presentation is that the intention is for us to get on the same page. So if you hear something different or something that I don't say directly, that's okay, right? Because now we can have that intentional conversation about what we're missing that might be coming from our own experiences, our own perspectives about what equity is supposed to accomplish, and of course, most particularly, what equity at the Met Council is supposed to accomplish in the context of the Regional Development Guide.
1 second. Greg, can you pull up C. Terrence's presentation, please? Thank you so much. You're a professor, so I had a hard time cutting.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yep. All right, thanks, Charles. All right, so in that spirit of trying to distinguish about what do we mean by equity, I'm going to start this presentation about what I'm not talking about when we talk about equity. So in particular, I think there's this need to distinguish reparative justice and equity from these things. Things like performative allyship, right? We can just sort of write the thing that we're going to do but not have actions behind it, right? This is really about how the Regional Development Guide will become a practical development guide for justice. This is not about the individual staff becoming better people, right? Of course, I'm always happy to give a book list for you to think about yourself, but really we're thinking in terms of structures, right? What is the structure that Met Council in this region produce to advance equity in and of itself? It's not to be done for others, right? This isn't just for the Met Council to do for the region, but it's to do with those who are in the region, right? Maybe not be led by those who are privileged, but of course everybody has a role, right? We can sort of talk about what I mean by privilege in this context, but we have to recognize positionality in conversations about equity, right? People come from different histories. Some people are the folks who have been harmed, some of the people who have benefited from these structures. We really need to think about that in this context because that's how we relate to people in the region in the first place. It's certainly not about electoral politics, right? I don't think I'm here talking about new council members, the council staff, right? That's not really what I'm here talking about. Again, it's the structures themselves. In my time as equity manager, my work was really sometimes boiling the ocean because we threw everything into equity as a whole, right? So things like internal diversity and inclusion campaigns. Extremely important work, but I think is different than equity work in and of itself. It's not about expanding our contracted pool itself, right? I think this work is deeper than that too, really important work. It's not just about training leadership to make better decisions. You have very capable and wonderful leaders here at the Met Council, but it's not just about talking to Charles and Lisa about what they need to do itself, right? We're trying to, again, think about the structure. And I think a really important point is it's not just about the full implementation of civil rights law, say like the Americans with Disabilities Act or otherwise. Those laws, of course, are extremely important. I think one might argue, if you can't do any of these things on the screen, or if you're not doing any of these things on the screen well, how can we go above and beyond that to do what I think equity calls for? In fact, some of the ways that I define equity is, let's just imagine that we fully implemented the Americans with Disabilities Act. We just snapped our fingers and we got there. I think there would still be a gap between where the Americans with Disabilities Act ends and what people with disabilities need to fully participate in society. Right? In fact, that is often that gap between civil rights law and what people need to be fully dignified and participate in society is probably what equity is mostly pointing towards. So I don't mean to say none of these things are important. I think sometimes I start off with these slides and I'm like, so what do you mean? No civil rights law? It's like, no, we ought to do these things. Sometimes it is the law to do these things. But equity, I think, is talking about something that's distinctly different. So I'll start there, come back, and of course we can talk about that more. One of the things that I love telling the story of is, starting with Thrive MSP 2040. In fact, that document is what got me to move to this region from Milwaukee in the first place. Right? For me, as a young transportation planner, it was the first time I saw equity used in a regional planning document. Right? And I think Thrive cast, at the time, a beautiful vision about how this region can move forward. But I think if you've realized, in 2023, times have changed, our expectations have changed. Community have different needs that have been realized or that have been desired, and now we're sort of trying to realize. But just to sort of tell the story from where we are from then to today, I sort of like to start with this map. Maybe y'all have seen this map. It's from the Met Council. It's areas of concentrated poverty by census tract, so the areas of purple are areas that are ACPs. And most regions around the country had to map this. Because I think in some ways it was how we defined the problem. The problem in our region is concentrated poverty. That was sort of the language in 2013 around that time. And a lot of the efforts over the past 10 years, not just in this region but around the country, has been about areas of concentrated poverty. In particular, how do we deconcentrate poverty in these areas? But one thing that, in fact, where I ended up working now here at CURA, we mapped something very different. Which was racially concentrated areas of wealth, so the exact inverse of areas of concentrated poverty. And part of this was organizers in the region wanted to challenge this narrative about areas of concentrated poverty. And in fact, if you sort of think through, I won't go through the full history of how did we get to this place, as Councilmember Lilligren talked about, where we have high levels of disparities. But what I would say, the road, how we got here is that we drove here. There were distinct policies that benefited some folks and burdened other folks. I think somewhat of that, a lot of that is realized in these areas of concentrated wealth and areas of concentrated poverty. Right? A lot of our public policy supported sort of these exclusionary areas outside of the cities to be bastions of wealth, and whether it was good schools or to do all sorts of things, right? So these racially concentrated areas of wealth, I think in some ways what CURA would say, are the benefactors of this historic policy. Areas of concentrated poverty are the folks who are most burdened by this legacy of policy itself. So it was important, I think, right? The Met Council mapped one of these, and I think no longer maps this anymore, right? At least it always corrects me because of challenges to those narratives. But it really begs a really important question. How do we define the problems of this region? What is equity trying to solve, right? Because if it's trying to solve areas of concentrated poverty, I think we're going to get one body of policies. If we're trying to solve for areas of concentrated wealth, I think we'd get a very different bodies of policies. In fact, maybe even saying we need to solve for racially concentrated area of wealth might just be a really radical thing to say because of how different it is in the context of public policy in our region, right? That's just a far-off narrative than I think from where we are today. But I think equity calls us to really ask the important question of what are we really trying to do here? Another thing to really think about, right, and this is just from CURA's work from our gentrification report from 2017 that maps the loss of affordability in the city of Minneapolis. So the green, I know it's hard to see from how far y'all are, but the green is we have Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, and white non-Hispanic on the right. 2000 on the top, 2014 on the bottom. Where it's labeled green is where the average person can afford housing, like from affordability metrics. So you can see for Black folks in Minneapolis, for the average Black person, there's no census tract in Minneapolis where they can afford from the average affordability. You can see it shrinking for everybody in the city of Minneapolis, right? So you can sort of see these sort of like the beginnings of displacement in some ways, even back, and you can see this change from 2000 to 2014. We like to sit this alongside our broader study, which sort of maps these areas that are gentrifying next to what these are some significant council investments. So you can see the light rail, the bus rapid transit lines. One of the great things I got to do with Charles back when I first got here was work on the C line in North Minneapolis, and I've knocked every single door, I think, along Penn Avenue, who are my neighbors where I live. And I remember being so excited at that time in 2015 to say, hey, aren't you excited, right? We're gonna invest in this community where y'all recognize historic disinvestment. But I was sort of struck by how many of my neighbors didn't feel that this was a great thing. They'd say, well, I would sort of summarize and say, well, it's interesting that you're investing now at the time that we're being pushed out of this place, right? And so you can see, the areas in dark blue are areas that have been gentrified, areas in light blue that are gentrifying, and if you kind of know where the sea line is on the left side of that map, it was going exactly through gentrifying neighborhoods. In fact, a lot of the council's investments sort of follow that. And the point is to point out that there might be two different narratives about the same project, right? For the council, this vision might be one that is equitable, right? An advancement of equity. But for community, it could be a time where they're being invested in at the same time they're being displaced, and that feels intentional, right? And this has shown up quite substantially, of course, in the blue line anti-displacement work that I just presented on last week, right? But from this perspective, again, what is equity trying to accomplish? Who gets to define it? How do we sort of understand whether we're doing it or not doing it? What are these important components that we really need to consider when we talk about equity from an organization like the Met Council? And I'm really thinking about that we need to maybe spend more time in this next regional development guide having a theory about what equity is trying to accomplish. So the question, who is, what is, isn't, or not the problem that we're trying to solve for is really the pertinent question, right? Because equity is great when we sort of talk about it abstractly, but I think this is really where the rubber meets the road, right? Equity, we assume, will have an outcome, right? It will have impact. So what is it the impacts that we're trying to get to? The framework, what we hope to get to is to help sort of understand this question and be able to diagnose and get a real answer to it as we move forward. So what's the narrative about the issue? Who benefits from the prevailing narrative, of course, becomes an important question, right? Some advocates say the paradigm of affordable housing development doesn't ultimately benefit the folks who most need it, right? That's a narrative that exists and I think has a lot of truth to it. Why we're building transit has a diverse narrative in this region as well too. Who benefits from the existing paradigm? What is the need for change in each of those paradigms to really get to what we're trying to get to is another way of asking the same question. So going back, and I won't read all these slides because they're extremely text heavy, but it's always worth going back to Thrive MSC 2040 because I think for some folks, I'm always like, more people need to know about the Met Council, right? I think as many conversations I've had in the past couple of months, like, what is the council's vision? It's like, read this document, right? And there was an equity vision in Thrive MSP 2040. These bullet points are the points within the equity part of the document that said this is what the council will do, right? So first bullet point, work to mitigate areas of concentrated poverty and racially concentrated areas of poverty by better connecting the residents to opportunity and catalyzing neighborhood revitalization, right? So that initial point about the narrative about areas of concentrated poverty were quite prevalent in Thrive MSP 2040. You've since stopped mapping that out of challenges to that narrative, right? So what are we going to put in its place? And so this document, talks a lot about areas of concentrated poverty. Y'all read this document all the time, so I probably don't need to. That's probably not true and true. But right, going back to that document to say what it will do. Angela reads it all the time, for sure. But there was, this is containing, there's a lot of bullet points in there, and I think some of these things y'all have done, some of these things you haven't done. Again, I won't read each and every one of them. I'm just sort of trying to make a point about how much has already been said. In here is where transportation was specifically identified and what transportation would do about it. So you can see things like conduct Title VI service equity analysis. And I'm sort of challenging that civil rights law and equity are two different things, right? Title VI analysis is the law. You already have to do that. So where are we going above and beyond that to really meet the gaps between equity and what challenging or changing these disparities in this region might look like, right? Complete environmental justice analysis that ensures no proportionately high and adverse impacts of transportation projects. Maybe the Blue Line Extension Anti-Displacement Project is a good way of doing that, but maybe there's other places that that kind of work needs to happen as well too. You in here have parks and open spaces, which was one bullet point. But I think I used this slide to also talk about one of the things about Thrive MSC 2040 was that Thrive and the policy plan documents were developed at separate times. And so what's interesting about the history that you can see in this document and sort of as a history of this organization is that there's one bullet point in Thrive. But if you read the Parks bullet plan, there's a lot more than one, right? And so you can see that growth in the organization over time. Now the intention, as I understand it, is to develop those policy plans as part of Thrive, because I think one of the challenges that you'll see is the different definitions of equity in each of the different policy plans was left sort of this incoherent way of navigating between each of the different divisions in work. And so just pointing that's one of the changes which I think is really important as well too. There was nothing in this document for water and resources and at all. There was a land use policy plan as well too, which connects to Thrive. So just to sort of point out that change, where we were in 2013 to where we are here today in 2023, obviously we'd expect a much more robust document. If you believe the sort of things that I say about, maybe we talk less about Title VI analysis and talk more distinctly and intentionally about what is equity supposed to accomplish above and beyond those things. Again, you're in a philosophy class right now, really, so I have to read you a quote from my favorite philosopher who was instrumental in debating this equity framework. And this is from Paulo Freire's Pedagogia de Press. Has anybody read that book before? Okay, I'll make sure everybody here gets a copy because everybody should have a copy. Freire writes, true generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need be extended less and less in supplication so that more and more they become human hands which work and working transforms the world. I think this does a good job to say, are we really addressing the root causes of what causes the inequity in the first place? Are we casting a vision in the first place that will see these disparities reduce over time? Or are we just sort of doing what we can, hoping that we've done enough to sort of quell folks? And that's a real critique that comes from this community, right? Did Thrive MSP 2040 even cast a vision that would make an indent into these disparities, or did it fall short? And if it did fall short, I'm certainly thinking about, right, equity that we're in not Thrive MSP 2050. There's going to be a new name for it. In the 2050 Regional Development Guide, thinking through how does equity really deal with the core aspects of inequity, right? And of course, taking into account what the council's responsibilities are and what other folks' responsibilities are, right? There will of course be a difference. But of course, this agency is used to working with a lot of different agencies, and this document is somewhat of a reflection of a lot of different agencies and organizations and governments' vision. So again, how do we sort of think in a sort of a philosophical way, but in a very practical way of how we're addressing equity? Hopefully find that in this quote as well too. So saying all that, and this is something that I teach in a whole class over a semester that I'm just breezing through in some ways over this hour. But this reparative justice framework, this initial concept was created when I worked at the Met Council. I was thinking about the council's work. And I wasn't thinking about things that didn't exist at the council. In fact, I saw in small places all the time that the council was really doing equity. Things like the West End and Route 9 transit study. My favorite station on the C line is at 29th and Penn, where no one ever really knows the story, so I'm actually really happy to be able to tell this publicly. There's a daycare on the northwest part of that corner. It's a Hmong daycare, and the folks came to a public meeting and said, in our culture, building something tall above our house is a symbol of bad luck. So if you go to that station, the pylon goes right before the edge of that house, so it's not sitting in the edge of the house. I think that's a beautiful example of equity and connecting the culture, right? I can think of the parks work that's being done. I can think of a lot of things. So in some ways, I hope this framework isn't alien. In fact, it was created of the council's work in and of itself, but it was also made to really distinguish about when do we know that we're really doing this thing, and when do we know that we're not, and how can we know if we're not doing it and falling short. So actually, the initial time that I presented this framework was in early 2018, just before I left CURA, in many departments within the Met Council as well too. And so I think one of the reasons I'm back here is because somehow that was a seed that's been watered over the past 5 years, that's been worked on since that time. And I was really thinking about the Bechdel test. Is anybody aware of the Bechdel test? You aware of the Bechdel test? The Bechdel test was a brilliant way of being able to understand in movies whether women were fully realized as characters, created by a cartoonist, Alison Bechdel. And it was just three simple parts. There's two women who speak to each other about something other than men. And it's amazing how many movies fail that test. And so the Bechdel test, there's still a website, you can Google Bechdel test and just see how many. But I loved how simple it was, right? You can understand whether you're doing it or not doing it. And of course, there's more complexity to think about, but it gives you an intention to point towards. So I was thinking about how do we have a Bechdel test in some ways for equity. I don't think mine's quite that simple. It's still aspirational in that way, but it was thinking about that as well. And of course, I was thinking about it as a practice, not just as a philosophical way of looking at it, right? What does it mean to actually do this thing of equity, not just sort of talk about it? Because then I think the colors become more clear in that way. So without further ado, our reparative justice framework really has 3 parts. It's contextualized, it's community-centered, and it's reparative. Contextualized is this idea that we're talking about an inequity in particular. There's so many governments and other organizations that say, hey, see, Terrence, help us make this project more equitable. And I'll say, great, what inequity are you trying to address? It's like, well, you just know how it's just inequitable in this region. We just want to make sure this project is more equitable. And I say, that doesn't really make sense to me, right? I think equity is addressing inequity, and the more particular that we are about understanding what inequity and why the inequity exists, the more clear we can be about what we can do to address it. I think sort of my other analogy is if you're trying to get to my house in North Minneapolis and plugged in my address into Google Maps will say, okay, well, where are you coming from? And if you said, well, it doesn't matter, just tell me how to get there, right, there would be no search results. There would be no results for that, right? But in fact, if you say where you're starting from, in fact, the corner that you're starting from, the more particular and helpful those directions are to get you to the direction that you're trying to go to. It's the same way for equity. Right? We understand that there's housing inequity, transportation inequity, parks inequity, water inequity, and all these things, but if we don't really understand the mechanization of them, we don't understand why they exist, who's harmed, who's burdened, by how much, it's going to be really hard to create that vision that actually challenges and changes equity in the first place. So ensures the solutions are addressing it in a systemic way, in a very particular way, especially when you're thinking about it from a regional development guide perspective. Then there's community-centered, right? This idea that people who are harmed should be the first creators and visionaries for what their healing looks like. I'll just use you, Councilmember Chambliss. If we just imagine a scenario, if I hurt you as an individual, who gets to decide what healing looks like between us two? If I hurt you, who gets to decide?
I think I should decide.
You should get to decide, right? I've never been in a room, especially with a very jokey professor no one's ever disagreed with that, right? Everybody agrees generally with people that are harmed should be in charge of their healing, right? And if that works for an interpersonal level, I think it also makes sense in a systemic level as well too, right? And I see this in projects all the time. Right? Governments historically have done a lot of the harm, yet they choose when to do the projects. They decide what the limits of those projects are. They might engage the community, but whether they agree with or disagree with them, they own the decision making at the end of the day, right? And then we sort of wonder why we get to the end of the projects and say, why don't folks see that this was for them, right? Because that wouldn't work for you as an individual. It's also hard for it in the context of systems, right? So how does this plan engage community in a sort of way where they have ownership over their healing, right? And it's not just as a matter of like, this sounds cool or sounds good, or that even might be the law, because that's a critical necessity of equity in the first place, right? So it's not just public engagement because we have to, but for a distinct purpose of folks having agency and power for themselves over the issues that they face. And then this idea of reparative. Does anybody, y'all have transit here, but does anybody happen to have a car? Does anybody have a car? Anybody have a car? You have a car?
Yeah.
Do you like your car?
I love my car.
All right, does it have a name?
No.
Okay, so you don't love it that much, but what color is the car?
Black.
Black. Okay, so let's just imagine I take your black car, I light it on fire, and I push it into the Mississippi River. You will never see that car ever again, right? Probably be pretty upset with me.
Huh.
You'd be very upset, and you've lost something, right? There's a material challenge to that.
Yep.
I'm an ethicist. I realized what I did was wrong, so I'm going to make this right. Okay? Come back. Here's a new pair of shoes. Are we good?
No.
No, right? No one would ever be good in the scenario of losing a car for shoes. Maybe a good transit system would be a good trade, in a sense. No. But we need a car for a car, right, at the end of the day. So we can sort of joke about it in this way, but then we can sort of contextualize into the history of housing where people have lost agency, they've lost wealth, right? Their communities have been maybe lost forever. And then today we might say equitable housing is Section 8 housing. And I'm not saying Section 8 housing is bad, like you'll never hear me saying that, but I don't think it's an equal value to what was lost in housing. So how does the vision that we're casting for equity not just sort of give people a piece of what they've lost, but how do we cast a vision that brings them fully whole, right? That is the difference between having disparities and not, right? And so it's really thinking through, like, is that our vision for equity? Because, again, it is oftentimes conceived of as equality. It is often conceived of as simply fulfilling Title VI analysis. It is simply sometimes just diversifying our staff. But I think each of those things individually and collectively fall short of what caused these disparities in this region in the first place. And so thinking through Thrive, or not Thrive, I keep calling it Thrive, the Regional Development Guide 2015, thinking about what are we contextualizing this inequity into, how is community not only just involved, but how do they have power and agency over their healing, and how are we casting a vision that really transforms disparities in this region is ultimately what I think the equity vision looks like. Now we can make this big, we can make it small. Again, I think the West End and Route 9 transit study is a really good example of this. It said, where are people who make $40,000 and less? Where are there jobs that pay $40,000 and less? We see a deficit in our transit system of connecting those folks. Let's correct that. That's a really good example of, I think, living this framework. The anti-displacement work that I presented on 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks ago. This is why we have displacement, right? This is how we center community. Here's some recommendations about what we can do about it, right? I think the recommendations, this can live in a big way, and of course, I think it lives in small ways as well too. So engagement alone is not transformational, right? By definition, right? It is this sort of thing where, am I doing a good job? Okay, right? I think we need to go beyond just that simple paradigm of engagement, right? Again, I think it's about thinking about agency and consent, right? Agency and consent, I know are very philosophical terms, but agency meaning this idea that you are a person who has value, who has worth, right? Consent theory in general that talks about, it's not just your ability to say yes to something or no to something, but it's about whether you have the power for it to be respected, right? So agency, does our community have enough agency to cast a regional vision, right? It calls for us to do more than just engaging the usual suspects. In fact, it's maybe the folks who don't show up on the meetings that we really need to make sure that we're fully capacitating and showing up in more powerful ways. So this agency, this critical to creation, imagination, vision is initiating this agency, right? This personhood that we have of folks who are being marginalized in our structures today, right? Within these dehumanizing structures, our agency is often challenged by the system's rules. We just kind of have to keep moving. This is the federal guidelines, this is the federal timing, right? We don't really have to do more, let's just keep moving. Right? But maybe our ethics and equity challenge us to do something a little bit different. If this personhood, our initiation of agency requires consent, right? People show up, they should have some power in decision making in some ways. How that looks like, of course, is a big conversation. And then this consent is the creation of healing, I think, at the end of the day, right? I think where people find humanity being dignified, right, I think comes from this people who have been historically marginalized, right, and lacking consent, right? You can't live here, right? There's racial covenants, or you've been redlined out of this place, right? Or you can't afford this place, and now the city council is saying, we're not going to build any housing for you that fits in this place, right? That's a denial of consent. When we're thinking about transportation systems and housing, we have to realize that those are issues of agencies and consent as well, too. So I want to make sure that's part of what we're thinking about when we think about equity. So, how am I doing on time? Okay. Okay, sorry, I talk a lot and I lose track of time.
You might want to.
Okay. So what I'll just sort of say about that, I call this the knowledge, power, and agency spectrum, 0 to 100. Let's just imagine you're like Angela. You went and you got your master's degree, and you've been doing this for a long period of time. She knows the ins and outs of policy and funding, and she's really good at what she does. Let's just say she's closer to 100 than she is on 0. 100 is to know everything there is to know about this subject, right? She's probably not a true 100. She'd probably say there's things I can grow in. But she's further along the spectrum. Now we imagine folks in community who don't have the same benefit of that education and access and work history, and maybe they're a 30 or a 40 on this conversation. If you think about this in the context of knowledge, power, and agency, I remember doing bus rapid transit work, and it would take some time to go from 30% design to 60% design, sometimes in the spectrum of years, right? And we would do that, and we'd simplify the language, we'd make it at a third grade level, so we'd take some technical details out, and we say, hey, come to this 2-hour public house meeting. We're gonna tell that to you, and if you have any good comments, then we'll change it, but if not, we're just gonna keep moving forward, right? In that construction between people who have a different level of agency, like for Angela that might work if we're talking about her spectrum, about her expertise. For folks who don't have that, right, that's really another place where they feel dehumanized, right? So how does this plan, not just as an outcome, but as a practice, move folks along the spectrum so that they can show up in more particular ways? So, key concepts. Reparative justice equity requires us building power in communities that historically have been robbed of it. Marginalized people have been primarily denied their agencies to be creators in their own context, which is what this plan is ultimately about. Equity is a project of personal healing in tandem with societal material distribution, right? Some communities in this region have a lot. Some communities in this region don't have enough. How do we live into abundance so everybody has what they need? We need to retrain our ears sometimes to listen to voices we are conditioned to ignore and or discount. Sometimes say, I'm not saying anything original here, but I know the language, I know the folks, I've got the degrees, I've got the history, where you can probably hear me really well, but I think there's nothing that I'm saying here that I don't just hear on the block that I live in North Minneapolis too, and those folks often aren't heard in chambers like this, and so how do we retrain our voices? So we can't just settle our debts for housing inequalities with Section 8 housing in wealthy white areas. I think equity calls us to do more than that. Can't settle our debts of neighborhood inequities by doing community engagement alone. I think it's deeper than that as well too. So what I'll leave this presentation with is my very non-technical analysis about who had power in decision-making and transitway development at my time at Metro Transit. So you can see little old me, I had a little bit, right? Charles was great. I think Charles listened to me. He was great. And we have other folks, and there's consultants, there's the cities. For a long time, I thought my job was, how do I get the folks in green to make better decisions for the folks in white, right? Folks in community. Like for a long time, I just focused all of my attention on individual leadership. And they're great folks. Again, like I really have a high degree of respect for the folks who work here. But then I really started thinking about this guy. This guy is Robert Moses, and maybe y'all know who Robert Moses is, but he's probably the most powerful bureaucrat in American history. The person who pioneered building highways through communities was this guy in New York City, right? And kind of cartoonishly evil. There's a great book about him called The Power Broker. One time I sort of said to him, like, well, what if people don't like what you're doing? And he said, well, too bad, it's my choice. Right? And so we can sort of look at this guy in history and say, like, this is the antithesis of equity work and planning in history. Like, I think this is the face of and I really think about, again, Paulo Freire. Like, leaders who do not act dialogically but insist on opposing their decisions, do not organize the people, they manipulate them, they do not liberate, nor are they liberated, they oppress. I think it's really, really easy to read this quote and think about someone like Robert Moses. But I also just think about this structure in and of itself. Now, I think this structure is making obviously very different decisions than what Robert Moses, right? This was about transitway development. But if this structure really cedes all the power in decision-making to not the folks who are harmed, then I don't think this structure is making Robert Moses decisions, but I think the structure is Robert Moses-esque, right? Because I think if we really believe that equity calls us to think about agency and power, thinking about contextualizing history, thinking about positionality about these issues, and how does an organization like the council, which of course has a responsibility and a participation in the creation of these inequitable outcomes in the region, but yet we want to change them, why can't our structures look more like this? And that's just as a thought exercise, right? If the folks who are most harmed in the community should be the people who are in charge of their own healing, why can't our structures look like this? And this is just as a thought experiment, right? Because I think this really is perhaps what equity is really challenging us, and really where the rubber meets the road, where we'll probably feel the most sort of difficulty. Maybe you feel this in your stomach when you're looking at this, and it's intended to do as such, because it is a big question, right? It is real people who have been hurt, real people who feel the pain of work that happens in this region, who want an organization like the Met Council, believe an organization like the Met Council, could do more, could be different, right? That this plan could have a real impact. So won't this thinking, won't reparations divide us? Not any more than I think we're already divided. The wealth gap or these inequities merely puts a number on something we feel but cannot say, that American prosperity, that Minnesota prosperity was ill-gotten and selective in its distribution. What is needed is an airing of family secrets, a contextualization of what's wrong, a settling with old ghosts, reparative vision. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche, our Minnesota community, and the banishment of white guilt. That comes from Ta-Nehisi Coates, the case for reparations. So that is what I have for y'all around our equity framework and how that might shift in the regional development guide.
We have some questions for you. I know that was a lot to take in. Oh, sorry. You're welcome to lead this conversation. We welcome any,
Lead, not lead.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
we welcome any initial feedback. We wanted to pose these questions for you as well as a continuation of this thought exercise. What narratives need to be more significant to frame equity? How should community inform the development of the next regional development guide? Community is defined by people, not local governments. That is a very different term for community. When we're talking about community, we're talking about people within cities. What does community need to learn about the regional development guide in order to be full participants in its development? I would add, what does accountability to these tenets look like as well?
Let's open it up. Anybody have some thoughts, reactions, comments, answers for the question?
Well, I'll jump in.
Go ahead,
If I may,
Jay.
Mr. Chair. So I want to answer your question, but I have another question. So as we continue to make policy, make decisions, and we see that, especially coming through COVID, I like data, and and yet we don't have all the data yet coming through COVID, so we know it's not getting better.
Right.
It's getting worse.
Yep.
So part of what I'm trying to understand is what we control,
Mhm.
and I mean what we don't control.
Yep.
And I've said this before, and I'm not an economist, but when we talk about economic opportunity, there's the economy out there and the private sector, and we don't control that. And that's where, how can we build in opportunity with the private sector so that the job creators are part of this connection for people to jobs in the continuum of moving forward in your life generationally. I don't know, I'm not sure how to bring those people in. We're good at other nonprofits and governmental units, and we need to be better at real community. But I feel like if there's a gap there, then what? So, and it's not to be answered now, but I struggle with that all the time.
I mean, I think that's a very practical way that community thinks about it as well too. And I guess I'll just use the Blue Line Extension Anti-Displacement Project as a very recent and relevant example in this space, right? A huge portion of those recommendations was about workforce in and of itself, right? Because of course a lot of this is a social gap. This is socially created, but often it's material as well too, right? There is income gaps between communities as well too. So the first thing I think folks think about is, can they pay the bills? Can they build that generational wealth that we're thinking about? Can they purchase into the homes, into the different parts of the region? So I think there's a lot of answers to it, but I guess what I'll just say is that question is always the first question in the community that I live in North. I know you used to live in North too, and I'm sure you felt that way as well too when you lived there as well. That yes, the jobs are the beginning. I wouldn't say the end of it, but is often the beginning of this conversation in a practical way.
And I just, I think I've said, how do we make sure we have an economy that also works for everybody?
Right.
And so that is just something that bothers me a lot. So that I just wanted to put that out there because I feel like we are trying to build this framework for the entire region, but not everybody who has a lot of agency and power in this region doing this work with us. That's all I'm saying.
Angela, do you have a comment?
I just want to, Chair and Council Member, thank you for your comment. I wonder if one of the things that Terrence said early on is like identifying what inequity we're trying to address might be helpful in that. Sometimes it's very easy to get lost in the sea like boiling the ocean analogy of all of the things we don't control. The council is a very influential and powerful organization. We have a lot of money under our responsibility as well. There are so many areas of influence that we do have a place at the table at. And I think that maybe focusing on the things that we do have a place in might be helpful to kind of like wade through that overwhelming, because there are so many directions an equity conversation can go. That might be helpful. It was helpful for me when I heard it personally.
And Mr. Chair, just to follow up, I agree with that and I embrace that. And I think where I'm at is, so we make decisions. We are making decisions have been made, we're seeing things come to fruition, it continues on, and things aren't getting better. So even what we can control, things are still generally going in the wrong direction, and that's where I'm starting to just feel that anxiety. I just want to express that, because that's something, a lens that I just, yes, what we can control, but if that's still not enough, we can have all the aspirations in the world. So I just, hope that we can get others that have more agency and power around opportunity and money for people in the region to understand this work, instead of like, oh, that's government over there, we don't have anything to do with that.
Right.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. I guess I just want to just point out too that I feel, from my perspective at CURA, the region's changing. A lot of frameworks are very similar. So you just saw the Bush Foundation, for example, just put up a whole host of money for something very similar. Each foundation is doing this exact work, and they're changing their funding priorities to more align, I think, with what this framework calls us to. So I'll just say as like a general comment, I don't think you're alone at thinking that, and of course thinking about how to make sure we're all sitting at the same table, having the same conversation at the same time is distinctly important.
Thank you.
For sure.
I think one approach for me would be try to engage more with traditional community leaders, because they have their fingers on the pulse of their neighborhood, and they have the intention of the people that look like them that they represent. And you have to engage more with the community leaders, because they know specifically where a lot of those needs are, because they're hearing it from their constituents. Right. And so the more you do that, the more, there's never going to be a perfect solution. We're imperfect people in search of perfect solutions. That fails right there. But you're just trying to get to a better place, and you can't do that. One of the things that Nelson Mandela said was, you can't ask me to lead you. You have to lead me with your needs and your desires, and then we can go forward. So, and it has to be part of that. You have to find out, and through that, not that those leaders specifically are going to take you there, but that's part of the piece of the puzzle. The other part, I think, is going down to the micro level, to the individuals, which I'm sure you guys are engaged in that. But you have to have the input from the leaders that know their people, that are engaged with their people, and they have been for a long time.
Chair, Councilmember Carter, I think that's exactly right. Also just as a matter of necessity, but also as a matter of practicality. Right? There's no way that just the staff of this organization can inhabit all the views and needs from this community. And I think at the beginning of the presentation, I said not to be done for others, but with others is a very practical point, right? I think I see oftentimes staff and folks working like, oh, I just can't think of it. It's like, you don't need to think of it. There's other folks who've already thought about it. Let's make sure that we're connecting in to make sure that one just has a matter of practicality of making sure that we're getting to what we need to get to. So 100% and absolutely believe in what you're saying.
Reva, you had your hand up.
Thank you. I really appreciate this conversation and the way that it was presented and framed, because we have a template to work with. Even though we don't have the time to actually dig down into this, I think each one of us could take this and take it away. So that's great. Secondly, I would like to talk about question number 3, what the community can learn, and it also kind of ties into what Commissioner Carter said about community leadership, and then also down to the individual leadership, and that narrative that people bring to the table and into the room with them. Understanding their personal power, I think, is something that could be investigated, and to help people to learn, so that when they are at the table, they have the tools to effectively engage and utilize their personal power. I also think there are different levels of leadership in a community, and we have a tendency to take the easy route and go to the well-known leaders or the most powerful leaders. And there are emerging leaders as well. So I think that's the biggest thing that I think could give us a lift and change the paradigm in how we move forward. Because if you have participants that don't understand their personal power, we're not going to get the best engagement out of them. We're not going to, they're not going to be able to utilize all of the power that they have within and around them.
Robert.
Yeah, thanks for this work, both of you. It's just such an impressive body of work, so beautifully presented, and so I feel really fortunate to have seen that. And to see Terrence, I love the knowledge, power, agency spectrum, and it just really gave affirmation and I guess an understandable framework of how I kind of stumbled into politics and governing and policy making. There was a design process for an interchange at Lake Street and 35W, and I somehow just sort of stumbled into the conversation and then was given a bit of power, I guess, or agency, because I was appointed a Phillips West neighborhood representative to the Project Advisory Committee, which I think was the first federally funded context-sensitive design project here. And no one ever explained that to us in the community. That's what was going on. They were supposed to be listening to us and designing around the context. More, I would say, affirming what you taught us or what you presented here tonight. And I didn't know anything. And I would sit this, I went for hours and hours every month. It was 3 different meetings. I'd sit in this room. There were a lot of professionals and a lot of policymakers who understood what was going on and where this funding was coming from and where this piece was coming from. And I thought, how can I not know any of this? Nothing. And so I started to learn a little. And then I got to the day where I was sitting at one of these meetings, at Project Advisory Committee meetings, and I didn't like what the elected officials around the table were saying, and I was just a screamy little Phillips activist, who was more resilient back then, I guess, and could sit through all this. But I remember thinking, wow, I can't believe these guys are saying this. I thought, you could destroy a political career in this room, and because I'm kind of an asset-based person, I had to flip it over. And I thought, well, I mean, if you could build a political career in this room, and that was kind of one of my first steps toward running for office, all those years ago. And so that was really affirming. But what really came out, and this is something you were saying, Judy, it was about, this kind of goes to the third question as well. What is community need to learn? But it's this knowledge inequity, right? I mean, the status quo is just holding all this information, and if people don't know, and how many times, I know we've all been in community meetings where we're way down the line in designing transfers, and go, well, I've never even heard of this. How can this, and it's through all of our community engagement efforts, we're not reaching everybody, and so it's this knowledge inequity. And so what does the community need to learn? It's sort of what you said in the opening, what my council does, how we work. And, we were talking before this meeting about how mysterious county boards can be to people, and it's the same sort of with Met Council, where nobody really quite knows what they do. They just hear the bad stories in the press. So I think there is a level of community education, and I think what Reba said is right. It's just emerging, The system didn't want me at these meetings. They did everything to, stomp on me and, call my voice and stuff, and I just wouldn't go. So it is, how do we find people who actually want to kind of learn? And that's one of the reasons I ran for office, to figure out how this stuff works and to educate other people. And the idea of trusted intermediaries, of course, is everything. And then there's a community side that I think is really hard to get to. And I think I've told this story here before, but I came from a very grassroots place. I ran for office, got elected to Minneapolis City Council. Finally, I was moving up the power and agency spectrum, right? And as soon as I had an election certificate, as soon as the ink was dry, everyone distrusted me. All of my old activist friends. I was the man all of a sudden. And it was really painful. I thought, well, we've been shoulder to shoulder for decades in some of these cases, and all of a sudden I'm not to be trusted. And so I know it's about trust, and that's huge and everything, and how do we, from where we are, this mammoth unit of government, how do we convince isn't the right word because I don't think you can convince, but allow for the community to see us as real partners, and it's a challenge. And I would say the quick answer is it's resource intensive, right? To find these people that Rita was talking about, that Terrence was talking about, it takes effort, time, and money, and people power. So I mean, that's how we can kind of get to that level of engagement, and we'll see how far we can get. We'll have some time. Thank you.
Great comments. Wendy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm the kind of person who likes to make decisions with people rather than at them. People who seek power scare me a little bit, or maybe a lot. But I as I'm listening to all this, I really like the part about looking at that specific inequity and dealing with that rather than trying to draw a broad lens. Because the broad lens stuff always seems to turn into stereotyping, which I think is, and you end up doing the exact opposite of what you are supposed to be doing and reinforcing the stereotypes. But I think we need to consider that there are people who might by somebody be perceived as powerful, or the intergenerational wealth. I always look at Charlie when I think of intergenerational. But a lot of times those people don't feel like they have any agency with us. Like the communities that were all in purple and red around the edge of the metro on your one map. Most of them feel like we either don't care about them or actively hate them at the Met Council.
Yeah.
And so we need to acknowledge those sorts of imbalances as well and not make assumptions on what the dynamic is based on outside things.
This was just a great presentation, and I loved it. I follow you into your philosophy class Terrence. But I was thinking of other presentations we've had here. Maybe Angela, you and Lisa and others have given them when you've said maybe it's about climate, and you're just like, where are the levers for Met Council? And we have, we're planners and we set policies and we give grants. But it's kind of those more explicit conversation about if we want to bend the curve or change the world, where are the levers? And I think I keep thinking of that as how we manage both describing those levers and how we share those levers and how we even find through community and others to help establish what they really are. Because I think sometimes it's mysterious. The Met Council. They're very powerful, or the Met Council, they're not powerful at all. I mean, who knows? We wonder ourselves, and we talk about it explicitly. And I think having this very explicit conversation is really helpful for us to think more, not just getting beyond philosophy to the practicality of so what does this mean? What are we going to share? How do we share it? And I love the idea of talking about the structure as opposed to this will be the vision and this is what you'll do. And I always invite people to watch the Dow Chemical black and white video. You can find it on YouTube where the highway engineer with a white coat comes to the small town and describes the benefit of the interstate. And it's kind of a lecture. And it's kind of like, Farmer Bob, you will get your goods to market. And don't worry, nurse, Marianne, so it's very male, white, very top down, expert, and we have expertise. So does that mean that we have the power? Well, often we have to check ourselves. Well, yeah, engineers we have great respect, but sometimes we have to go, for what purpose? Great conversation, and I really appreciate it. Here's Tina.
Can I just
Judy.
Jumping up, what's hard for me at Met Council, just in my role, I come from city, and I would be in people's backyards, and I would be at the park, and they would see me at the grocery store. I'd see them at the library, right? I was immersed in it. What is harder here, and I have a pretty good pulse of my cities, and I deal a lot with their city officials, but all of this engagement stuff, which our staff is great at, and I know if there's a project going through a certain part of our region, those district people are brought in, council members are invited in, and I don't have a lot of that going on. I have housing issues for sure. I have the start of maybe a BRT route. I have a full-time job, which, you know, a lot of us have the other part of our lives so that we can continue to have a place to live and pay for my car and the things. But I struggle because I would, and I just have to say, I got my start in all of this on the north side, like door knocked it, was at the meetings, going everywhere. And I feel like I get it when it's packaged up and it's ready to go. And I'm just like, God, I hope this is right, because I'm missing being in a room just listening to people. And that is hard for me. And we can't be everywhere all the time, but we have big projects to get voted on here. And I just don't feel like, you know, there's a lot of trust. You know, we have great staff and yada yada, all the experts here at Met Council. I love them all, respect them all. But we've also here, we're a big organization, we've done things a certain way, and this is how you do the bus route, and this is how you do the stationing, and this is how the sewer goes through, and, you know, by the book and all the regulations. And so I wish there was a way, you know, I don't want to go showing up in somebody else's district and messing with them, but, you know, I am trying to extrapolate, you know, that community feedback. You know, if you're in the room and you spend time in community, you start to get it. But some of us are taking votes and we're just reading it on paper. They don't know to email us. The community, I mean, I wish we would hear from people that please contact the Met Council. And even at the City of Plymouth, we had one email and it would go to everybody. So they didn't have to write down 7 separate emails, right? And we would tell them, don't be afraid to just tell the council what you want. And we would get it in droves. And those were the best decisions when the council chambers were full. We barely get anybody that comes to our meetings. By the time it's here, city officials will tell you too, it's a done deal. I hate that because I feel that that process for me is the opposite of what we need to be doing here. And I don't know how to change this. And so, you know, sometimes I think in certain meetings I express that frustration because by the time it gets to us, and it's gone through committee, but man, sometimes we're on schedules because there's deadlines and federal requirements, and I'm thinking, oh man, it's just, we aren't at the pace of community sometimes, and so I'm just saying that because it bothers me so much.
Gotcha.
Councilmember Johnson, I appreciate those comments, and I think one of the things that came to mind, you know, you had some really elegant examples of what equity looks like on a micro level. And some of the best work that we do is that micro level one-on-one with community. And what I'm trying to wrap my head around as we're moving into the regional development guide plan is how do we scale that up to a huge, you know, to a huge regional planning process. And there's, you know, there's some elements in that, you know, bubble chart that you showed where there's the top-down approach where you go to the general manager and you talk about these principles. But there's that whole middle piece in between that is the most challenging part to reach, and that's where all of the systemic inequities exist. And so how do we, I don't expect you to have the answer ready to go for me, but that's what I'm, you know, really wrestling with as we're having this conversation. And I think Councilmember Johnson just illustrated how it really happens at that local level. And we as a regional body struggle with that because we are looking at a larger scale projects, larger scale planning, system-wide.
Absolutely, Chair, Councilmember. Yeah, I certainly appreciate that, and I think sometimes I get so worried about this presentation because it makes really people feel like they're in the middle of the ocean about all of this. And I try and call attention to examples that this work already exists in places in the council. But I think that idea of contextualization really is the most important part, right? And I think if you read in IWC 2040, there's another document, Choice, Place, and Opportunity, that talked about this is how we understand the problem in our region. And that became sort of the fundamental driver, was the source of what equity work did. So I think if you read Choice, Place, and Opportunity, it matches up with the work that the council has done over the past 10 years, but at the same time, the council has been growing and evolving, and part of that was hiring a team of public engagement folks. In fact, that was the job that I accepted to come work at the Met Council for the first time at Metro Transit. But I think this organization has changed since then. To even have this conversation is actually blows my mind in a lot of ways, given like even where we were 5 years ago. And I know a lot of council staff would say the same thing. But I think the first question really is, what are we trying to address? Because if there is nothing that you're trying to address in particular, then it really is going to feel like you're in the middle of the ocean. But if you can say displacement is the issue that we need to address within our transitway development, right? We had a very concrete project that worked on that, right? Or if it's let's connect people to jobs, or it's we see a gap of housing for people making under 60% AMI being built, right? Whatever you, like that's the most important part. I think that when I'm talking to Angela and her team, it's like, okay, what's the problem? What are you trying to address? Before you get to engagement or why you're trying to connect to people or what you're trying to do about it, what is it that you're trying to do? So it's almost worth in your head sometimes to say, okay, what are the things that we need to do? Write them down in a bullet point, right? That's really what it's like in my head when I'm doing this work. So yes, I know it feels like you're in the middle of the ocean, especially like it's like the first day of my philosophy class, like you really feel like you're in the ocean. But that's the practical part, right? Once you know what you're trying to address, that becomes the roadmap of what you're gonna do from there. Like you know who was hurt by the work, you know who you need to engage, right? You know how much they are hurt and what they lost, you know what we're trying to get to make them whole. So I hope that at some point as y'all are thinking about this, like how to just sort of bring it back to that practical place. I mean, there's a lot behind it, a lot that sort of informs that worldview, but it is really that practical place. And I'm sure you have, if I say that, you can come back and be like, yes, these 5 things that I hear in my community that I think are important to address in the next regional development.
Wendy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That brings to something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. After you decide that what are the things you can do, what would happen if you actually do them, and is there other collateral damage that goes on with that? The thing that's been going through my head so much is all of our public safety challenges that we've been having, because they decided that people were being put in jail too much, so now they don't put them in jail. Well, then that person, instead of having consequences and maybe turning around, continues to do it again because there were no consequences. The person they victimized doesn't have justice for themselves because there was no consequences. And a lot of what our Metro Transit Police Department and bus operators and train operators have been dealing with are not dealing with that one thing because they felt like some people were being arrested too much and put in jail too much. So don't make collateral damage with your solution, or look at, if you zoom this out to a big level, I mean, it's easy to make solutions on an individual level. When you're dealing one-on-one with people, you can always craft solutions, but if you make a big level, are there other unintended consequences that are going to come from that? Because I think we're going to be dealing for a long time with what happens because we're not dealing with the crime that's going on or the untreated mental illness or other things that are going on.
Yeah, Chair, Council Member, you know, the framework like, visually is designed as like a cyclical wheel, and that was intentional because I think we'll fall short in some ways. Like as much as I try to convince my kids that like I'm the wisest person on the planet, like, or that I'm doing everything right as a parent right now, I'm just waiting for that moment. Hopefully they feel comfortably in this moment when they get older to say, hey Dad, I wish you did it this way. Then I can hear and receive that at that time. Yeah, I want that, right? As a parent that like truly loves them and really, you know, wants them to be whole. And like I think it's gonna be similar in this work, right? There's things that we think are the right idea right now that 10, 20 years from now, they might think of something different, right? You know, during the civil rights era, Derek Bell was criticizing the civil rights law at the time to say, hey, it might leave us short, and right? And now that practice has turned into critical race theory and critical theory in general, and we say, yeah, I think we could have done something different within ADA or within the civil rights law, or we're revising our Title VI analysis processes all the time to sort of better reflect what we hope to get out of them. I think that's going to happen. So like one thing is like relieve yourself of the tension of believing that we won't get to that point. We will get to that point. What we hope that we are doing, I think, when we are revising our structures, that structures become learning structures themselves too. So like to the point of what Councilmember Carter, what Councilmember Johnson were talking about before, that that we might hear some things and change these things too. I think that's the beginning. People will be like, it's not a done deal if an organization can learn how to hear things and make changes. I want to again say that this is something the council's already done, right? Central Corridor, we got a process for doing that. The council learned, and now you have the anti-displacement project that came along with it, right? That's a primary example of the council learning from that conversation with community and trying to do something different again today. We're going to fall short in this process, probably, but hopefully, again, we sort of learn from this and continue to do better and revise and make people whole if we can, and not just sort of stop in that conversation. So, yeah, absolutely, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a part of the process that we have to be, and sometimes patient for and comfortable with, and knowing that this is sometimes a generational project and not just one that's solved today at the same time, too.
Angela.
Chair and council members, this is such a great discussion. We do have a hard stop at 5:30 because I want to respect Craig's time on the agenda. I have a couple other slides that are just to talk about next steps, if that's okay.
Great.
Greg, if you could pull up the next, the last part of my previous presentation, that'd be great. But I do want to really thank everyone for being engaged and considering new ways of doing the work that the council is really well known for. The council can have a big impact, and the Regional Development Guide is the opportunity to do that. As we're thinking about next steps, thank you, Greg, I really appreciate that. This is just some key messages from what Terrence has been sharing with you. I'll just move to the next one, to just talk about next steps instead of that. So as we're looking at these lists of other questions, some of this was going into what a few of you were talking about, is how do we move into practical decision making? What are the council's commitments to take action? How are we held accountable to those things? How do we measure progress? All of that will need to be in the Regional Development Guide in some way or fashion. When we're talking about all of these questions, I think maybe the central question is, what are the council's equity goals? That requires identifying the specific inequities that we would like to take on. We have a whole host of divisions and work units in different areas of policy and big decisions and small decisions, all of which can be viewed through the equity framework. And so there will come a time when you're asked to make a decision, maybe a very difficult decision, maybe an unpopular decision, but are you committed to the equity goals that the council will set forth? We don't have those yet, obviously, because this is the first of that conversation, but there will come difficult moments. And so just being aware that equity work is difficult. So, thank you again.
Can I just one final question?
Sure.
And because I wasn't around on the last one. Do we adopt it kit and caboodle? It goes through all the policies, we review, or do we start going, thumbs up in directions as we develop? Because the reason I need to be able to talk to my people intelligently, and own this if I vote for it. And, when a big thing comes in front of you and you only have gotten pieces of it, and I appreciated your comment how this will be woven through all of our work. So I think you guys are full-timers at this. We show up, other than Charlie, he's full-time plus, of course, I'm down to, I think, most of the time. But,
For the record, I wasn't around the last time.
So I'm just trying to make sure that, again, we have it so that we're being steeped into it and not, big chunks where we, I want to have it inside and be able to. That's important for policymakers. So too many times something comes and goes, sure, right? This is too important for that.
Chair and Councilmember Johnson, thank you for saying that. I started the presentation earlier saying that we've been before you in a lot of different ways and a lot of different topics already. When you were working last year, because I know that you were part of the previous council, working on vision and values and talking about those beginning pieces, that's where equity was identified as one of the council's values and one of the cross-cutting regional issues. That is where this work comes from. So you've already been steeped in all of that, and all of those pieces are like building a foundation, of course, I'm talking construction terms, building a foundation for your house to sit strongly on. And so every piece of information that comes before the council, staff are using the framework and how we are doing our work. We're bringing it to you for consideration. But all of the work that comes before the council will be building into what the regional development guide work will ultimately represent. So thank you for recognizing that and for the.
Well, thank you so much for your work today. We have another meeting at, you have a 20-second comment?
Yeah, just real quickly, and that is, I would, as we move forward here, I'm co-chairing the equity committee, and we have the potential of a number of members. We have a 21-member board. Unfortunately, we don't even have half that show up, so we don't have a quorum right now. So I'd like to hear more about how you think we should engage this the equity committee, and we have 4 council members on there as well. Going forward, how it's integrated. I've been there where you've made presentations to the equity committee, but how do we engage them? I mean, presentation is one thing, but having some action, because we're losing attendance. And right now, if we don't, these are great resources because there's some of the young leaders and but if we don't take care of it, it's just wasting a lot of time. And I hate to promise something and then just no one show up.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. And you may not answer that right this second, but can we kind of hold on to that thought? Because it would be great to come
And that's not a new problem.
No,
It's
we
not
have
a new
plan.
problem.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We know that this conversation will continue. Thank you, everybody, for that robust thought. We're going to get Craig here to kind of do a purple line update. And for the record, my car is named.
What's the name?
Well, all right, it's Mrs. Peel, but only because Elon requires a name, and so some people who are older and male will know what that means.
Oh.
Try to live in. Thank you. Thank you. See you tomorrow. See you there. Yeah, in 2 weeks. We're gonna hear from Nick and Craig, and some of us, including Nick, has a meeting at 6. So
I've heard.
They can read your card because we know your name.
there you go. Right.
All you need is the name before you can do it.
Oh, okay. Well, you can let me know.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Chair and council members. Craig Lamothe, Metro Purple Line's project manager. Last name, French pronoun law, and the insect moth. So that's how you pronounce the last name. Canadian background. Preferred pronouns, he, him, his. Recognized here tonight, we don't have everyone. In particular, we don't have Councilmember Carter and Councilmember Lee, who are both Purple Line council members. So we will follow up with them after this meeting. Yes.
You mean Bento, not?
Well, as I understand, I'm going to redistrict.
Oh, the other part. Yeah, oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Unfortunately, Councilmember Bento no longer represents
mystery.
Purple Line. So I've got about 20 minutes of presentation, and hopefully that'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers before you have to do that here at 6 o'clock. Also recognizing some of you are seeing the Purple Line for the first time as new members of the Met Council. So Purple Line is anticipated to be a dedicated bus rapid transit line from downtown St. Paul, operating on Robert Street with G Line, and then going up and serving the Mount Airy neighborhood just east of the capital area, and then traveling along Phelan Boulevard through the east side of St. Paul, and then ultimately, what we'll get into a little bit now, it was a project that was going to utilize a former freight rail corridor where the Bruce Central Trail currently sits today to make its way up to the Maplewood Mall Transit Center, and then potentially north of 694. So we've done a lot of work on that alignment here in the last year, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the project, as you may have heard, is in a transition. And so I'll spend more time talking about where we're going here in the next year and a half, and that's really investigating Purple Line potentially being on White Bear Avenue between Maryland and Beam and St. Paul and Maplewood. I could spend an entire 20-minute presentation on bringing up to speed on the entire history of the project, which is very long. It was first identified in a MnDOT planning document back in 1998 as a commuter rail line to Hinckley. That was the first time the word rush line was identified in any government documents. Shortly thereafter, a rush line corridor task force was formed in 1999. And believe it or not, it still exists and meets twice a year today. And that's representatives all the way up to that Hinckley area along the original corridor. Locally preferred alternative was selected back in 2017 by the policy bodies and recommended for incorporation into the transportation policy plan. That has been the project we had been working on when we took the project over from the county in late 2021. A project that went to downtown White Bear Lake and was a bus rapid transit line. Shortly after the preferred alternative was selected, the county continued to advance the project through environmental clearance and through 15 to 25% design. We follow a similar process on the BRT projects, just not statutorily required like the LRT projects, but basically following a municipal approval, seeking approval of the municipalities the project will serve on the 15% or preliminary design plans. That was done in spring of 2020. And then shortly thereafter that, we encountered the pandemic, or the start of the pandemic. And then as we took the project over, really that milestone was in December of 21 as we were entered into the federal funding program for this project. That's when officially the council took the project over. One note on that, we are anticipating, based off the new direction we are embarking upon now, is that we will not successfully complete the project development phase, which is a finite 24-month exactly phase dictated by the federal program. We will need to seek an extension from FTA, and we'll be negotiating with FTA staff here over the course of the summer on an extension to our current PD phase so that we can complete all of the requirements of the PD phase and then eventually progress forward. A little bit on our terminology. We had been talking about, last time we were before this group, route modification study. That's essentially what we had been doing over the course of the last year, really trying to truncate the locally preferred alternatives to somewhere south of downtown White Bear Lake, per the resolution that was passed by the city in March of 2022. And we are now calling that work phase 1, because the new work we're about to embark upon, we're going to call phase 2. But all of it is a route modification study. That original work was just simply to truncate that line. As part of that process, I'll give you an update on where we ended and where we're wrapping up. We were asked to look at 3 different possible endpoints. One at an existing park and ride in the city center of Venice Heights, one at the Maplewood Mall Transit Center and Park and Ride, and then one at Century College. And we explored over a course of about 10 months various different ways to get to each of those 3 endpoints, and that's what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. These are the alternatives that we did very deep technical analysis on and did public engagement upon. A lot of the work that we did, because we were starting with a very defined project, it was a project we inherited from the county, environmentally cleared, 25% design. We were well on beyond 30% design when we embarked upon phase 1 work. So we were looking at simply truncating an existing well-defined project. So we focused first and foremost on ensuring that that project remained federally viable since we were in the federal program. And that's this slide here. Project justification are the criteria the feds use for justifying the project and then local financial commitment. A lot of it though is essentially ridership, vehicle miles traveled, and cost driven. So that's what we were focused on. We're anticipating changes to the federal program, the biggest changes since 2015. Toward the end of this year, that'll change rating breakpoints, criteria weighting, and the criteria themselves. So essentially we'll be given new rules to the game this year through which to filter purple line as we continue to do work we're to start here this summer.
Mr. Chair, are those post-COVID rules? Is that the changes?
Yeah, essentially in addressing unprecedented inflation, accounting for that as well.
Thank you, sir.
So where we ended our work late last year was that we had adjusted a lot of the work to be post-pandemic, even though we didn't have the tools from the feds yet, like a new ridership forecasting model, but we were able to tweak things to represent what we're seeing out there in a post-COVID environment. Most predominantly, we're not seeing a lot of park and riders. We're not a lot of seeing those traditional downtown commuters. We all know that about 85% is where we're at of 85% down still in the express commuter market. So we attempted to reflect that using backdoor mechanisms And that resulted in us only having a valuable project to the mall and via 2 different routes. Everything else did not work. Did not mean that there was not transit needs in Vadnais Heights or to Century College. It just meant we could not make it work through this federal program. So what we're shifting gears and have been shifting gears since really early April is embarking upon or planning to take off on phase 2. And so this is in response to the county letter to the city that said we'll look at White Bear Avenue as an alternative to the Bruce Center Trail corridor. The Corridor Management Committee in May endorsed the project team exploring the feasibility of modifying the route to operate on Maryland and White Bear Avenue in dedicated lanes with lane reconfiguration. And what that means is that we would be generally staying within the public right-of-way that exists today, and we would be reducing lane capacity to be able to provide 4 dedicated transit lanes on White Bear Avenue. Because White Bear Avenue was looked at in a previous phase back in 2015, 2016 for BRT as part of earlier phases of Rush Line. Back then, it was inconceivable at the time to consider such things as lane reductions. That just was not prevalent in this region like it is now, where there's a lot of conversion of roadways to less capacity to provide for bike lanes and for transit and for pedestrian space. So it basically assumed wiping out the houses and businesses on one side of White Bear or the others. That was the scenario that was looked at back in 2015. That is not what we're doing here with this effort. The goal of this effort is to evaluate that new route alternative up to a level sufficient to make an informed decision and comparison back against the Bruce Center Trail corridor. Because that is still the project. That's what was environmentally cleared. That's what we have 30+% design on. But there's a lot of momentum and energy behind exploring White Bear Avenue. And so we'll figure out whether we can make that work, and then where does it want to end on that north side. So this is what we're looking at right now, is basically not changing the route south of Maryland, making that connection to Maryland, and then coming across, going east, and then going north on White Bear, and then serving the Maplewood Mall Transit Center and St. John's Hospital area, what's known as the North End District in Maplewood. This is different. We will not be leading with cost, ridership, and rating. That'll actually be more toward the end of this process. We're going to be going back and looking at the criteria that was used to select the locally preferred alternative back in 2017. So staying consistent with the purpose of the project. And so that's will be what we're focusing on. And we're really starting at a 0% level of knowledge. And so we're doing a lot of community engagement that I'll talk about a little bit later. And we're really doing planning level work. We're not doing design work over the course of the next year and a half. And we're going to start with what we learned from the previous phase, which is we can get to the mall. We're not sure we can go north of the mall. And so we'll first try to prove that we have a viable project, a technically feasible project to the mall, and then potentially explore, as indicated by this map here with the dotted lines, going further to the north if asked to do that. But we will not, like we did last phase, run concurrently 3 different endpoints at the same time, since we have learned a lot from the last phase. We do need to compare back, so there's, you probably have heard, and we have seen through the engagement we've done over the last month or so, a lot of energy and excitement over us exploring White Bear Avenue, contrasting to the lack of excitement we had on co-locating with the Bruce Center Trail corridor. But we still need to compare back. That was environmentally cleared by the federal government back in 2021. So at the end of this phase, we will need to compare back and make a decision on what is best for Purple Line moving forward. We're going to stay true to the process that we've used for these projects, a committee process for stakeholder coordination and decision making. We will be doing, starting issue resolution teams, which are really working with all the technical staff of all the project partners on a weekly basis starting in July for months. And then we'll be taking things out to our technical advisory committee, which is a group of the higher level technical staff, typically public works director, community development directors of our partners on a monthly basis. And then our community and business advisory committee, which we will be making adjustments to. We have representation that's more geographically oriented to the Bruce Center Trail corridor, which is a mile to the west of the White Bear Avenue corridor. So we are going to be looking to supplement membership on the CBAC committee, so we have residential and business interests represented on that committee. And then the Corridor Management Committee that Chair Zelli chairs, and Councilmember Carter and Lee will be sitting on in place of Councilmember Vento. So this is what we see the process to look like over approximately the next year and a half. We are still firming up the work plan and schedule. We are working with our consultant teams to understand how long it's going to take and what needs to be done. And we'll be sharing that with our CBAC committee on the 21st of June and with the Corridor Management Committee on the 29th. So I'd say we're pretty firm, but we're still working through some of the details. We think it's about a year and a half process to complete all 6 of these planks. We are focused right now on really understanding the corridor. We're starting with a zero knowledge base. So from a technical standpoint and engagement standpoint, talking to the people that are using the corridor, living in the corridor, working in the corridor to really understand what they see as the good and bad about the corridor as it stands today, since what we're proposing is not just layering in a transit project, but transforming the corridor through lane reduction as well. So we really want to understand the corridor deeply. So that first plank is really going to be a major focus of the summer. We expect it to carry through the end of August. And one of the big outcomes of that is identifying the dots on a map, identifying where those stations want to be on White Bear Avenue. We're really restricted to where the roadway crossings of the former freight rail corridor were for the Bruce Vento Trail. So we only had 4 stations between Maryland and Maplewood Mall Transit Center. We expect to have more than double that many stations on White Bear Avenue and Maryland Avenue. But we need to figure out where those want to be. And so we will be coming before the Corridor Management Committee in September to get their concurrence on the proposed station locations after we've worked with technical staff and the public on where those stations want to be. And then starting overlapping with that other plank is the second plank, which is really developing what does the roadway want to look like. It is going to be challenging, I'll be honest with you. There is not a lot of consistency between Maryland and Beam Avenue on White Bear Avenue, except for, by some miracle, there are no on-street parking in that entire stretch. That is the only commonality from that entire distance. The right-of-way ranges from 67 feet to 138 feet. It's 4 lanes, undivided in certain areas, and then it's 6 lanes divided in other areas as well. So trying to figure out how to provide a dedicated transit line on that corridor will take a good chunk of time to work through. And so we envision hopefully getting to about November, getting down to 3 to 4 alternatives we think that works best on that corridor after working it through a process to probably start with a much larger bucket of options, the design options. And then we'll come before the Corridor Management Committee seeking concurrence on those 3 to 4 most promising alternatives that will then fully and deeply technically evaluate, as well as go out to the public on. What we don't want to do is go out to the public on 12 different options and ask for their opinion on 12 different options of how to lay out the street. 3 to 4 is probably something more manageable and we can have more meaningful conversations. Okay. So on this project, Council has taken about 7 actions since 2021, mostly related to consultant contracts, partnership agreements with MnDOT, as well as a few other items, and a funding agreement that we have in place right now. We have $39.9 million of Ramsey County funding to fund the work we have done and the work we're planning on doing here for the next year and a half. And with that, I will turn it over to Nick.
So last fall, the council adopted the Transway Advancement Policy, so I want to center where we're at on the project relative to that policy. This is a graphic we use a lot within that policy, talking about the progress of a project. At the core of that policy was for us to bring forward, when we were asking for major actions from the council, a discussion about what major risks are tied with both this Transway and overall for the council. We envisioned a linear process for the project where a local planning agency would develop an alternative in the transportation policy process, the council would adopt that, bring that in, and then the council would eventually take over the project and work through these gates. With what Craig has said is we're actually going backwards a little bit. We are going to need to amend the transportation policy plan eventually for the new route, be it Bruce Vento, Andy at Maplewood, or this new alternative. So we will be utilizing the advancement policy for both the transportation policy plan update, and as we're moving forward, there's several steps where we'll be asking for major decisions from the council. So we will bring forward the enterprise level risks and the risks related to your actions as at least 3 times in the next year and a half. First time will be this fall. We'll be amending the capital grant agreement with the counties, and I think we'll bring a good discussion. That's a major financial commitment that we asked the council to make with our agreement with the counties. So we'll talk about risks there related to the project. In the next summer, we'll be amending our major engineering contracts, very similar to what we did with the Blue Line recently. So we'll want to be updating risks then and with the council, so you're making, before you're asked to make a decision, you fully understand the risk that we're taking on by bringing that. And then looks like maybe fall of '24, the TPP would be amended. There's a little bit of a timing component with when the new TPP is going to be adopted, and whether it's an amendment or just part of the adoption of the overall transportation policy plan. But that's the point where we talk about the long-term capital needs of a project like this and what the costs are and whether we have revenue. Our new legislative outcomes will really simplify how we talk with the council about, can we afford this project? Both the operating costs in the context of all our system and the long-term capital maintenance costs of a project like this. We'll much clearly be able to talk about that relative to all the other transitways. So that's really good. In terms of the enterprise risks, there were 2 parts to the policy. One was the transportation policy plan. You've adopted the process for that now recently. The other part was determining as a council what are the enterprise risks of the council. That process is still in process. Early this spring, we talked a lot about enterprise risks related to the Blue Line. We've now, since that time, hired a consultant, Enterprise Risk Management. They're developing, we're going to use the Transitway Advancement Policy as their first step in helping us set up the framework for how we define risks, how we set how the council tells us about how much risk they're willing to take, and the rating of risks. And so that is still in process, but we are definitely, that consultant's on board, and we're starting to work through that. So I think we're trying to have very consistent discussion about enterprise level risk, not just for Purple Line, but each of the transitways that we bring forward to you. And so more to come on that, but it's underway. So, and then even the risks we talked about this spring are very different now post-session. So I think we've reduced a lot of the financial risks that the council talked to us about in terms of capital maintenance and operating maintenance. But we had a lot of other risks that I think are unchanged in the sense of by the legislature, and so we'll be updating some of that discussion too. But I think in the good news of the outcome of the legislature is a lot of risks were reduced, and I think we had a lot of early discussions in the spring about that the legislative path was how those risks were going to be reduced. And so there's a lot of positive news on risks also. So just wanted tonight to highlight that when we're bringing these, this policy is being applied. It's just not tonight because we're just giving the information on, but it will be in the future on Purple Line before you're asked to take any big actions.
I will wrap it up with a couple slides on engagement because I think that's important to touch on Purple Line. Last year, we were getting to the conclusion of the technical evaluation, understanding if we could or couldn't get to those 3 different endpoints, and we were ramping up for a more robust engagement as a result of having that information in hand to share it with the public. And that was about the same time that the City of Maplewood passed a resolution at the end of October saying they wanted an extension of the phase period and wanted to do more engagement, which ended up being their own city-led engagement process that occurred in February and March. So out of respect for our project partner, we kind of pulled back and didn't really do any engagement of our own after about mid-October timeframe. So we put everything on hold, and we carried that forward all the way really through the end of March until the conclusion of the city-led engagement process that led to the letter from the county to the city. And since the beginning of May, we have been back out in force with our engagement staff, engaging the community all along the corridor, including the new portion of the corridor on White Bear and Maryland Avenue. And so we're approaching it with all the traditional ways we have, and we're starting to think about new ways to do it, in part to some of the conversation you had here with the earlier topic. And so these are some of the things that we're doing. We're just starting. A big piece and focus for May and June is ensuring that everybody knows we're looking at White Bear and Maryland Avenue, just in case they miss any of the news articles, so that nobody can say they weren't touched. And then really building our Rolodex, so to speak. I'm dating myself, so it's don't exist anymore. But understanding who's in the corridor, because we don't know the corridor like the people who live, use, and work in the corridor. So we're trying to get names and numbers and contact information from folks, so we have that as a database to then pivot in July and August to a different type of engagement to support identifying station locations and start getting into understanding the good, bad, and ugly about the corridor as it is today. And the best people to tell that are those who are in the corridor. So we envisioning using that network to be able to do different types of engagement, including taking our engineers and planners out and doing short walking segment tours with business owners or community members in segments of the corridor. Not walking from Maryland all the way up to Beam, which might be an all-day effort, but breaking the corridor up and really trying to have meaningful conversations with people face to face. And so we plan on doing that here starting in July. This is just a piece of what we've been sharing with folks out on the corridor about us looking at Purple Line being on White Bear, and also talking to White Bear Avenue community and maybe answering questions about what is BRT, since that may be new for them. We're out since the beginning of May, 2 to 3 events every week. We're out meeting with folks, we're doing canvassing, we're setting up tables at events, and we actually made a point to get out to the schools before school wraps up this year, and we heard actually from a lot of the Johnston Senior High School students that getting to Century is important to them. So we did hear that. We've ridden the route 80, 64, and 54, so that's a little different than the previous corridor we were looking at. We weren't replacing bus service. We weren't in a corridor with bus service. There are 3 existing routes that exist out on White Bear Avenue today. So meeting with folks like that, and then basically making use of the nice weather, going to the farmers markets and places like that, trying to talk to as many people as possible. I'll say that there's a lot of excitement over us looking at White Bear Avenue, is what we've heard in the last 6 weeks. We have run into folks who are like, why are you looking at putting it on this corridor? Why don't you keep it on the other corridor you've been pursuing for the last several years? So it's not unexpected. Very few things in life have universal backing, and so we're going to run into folks that have a different opinion. And so we expect to get that. But mostly a lot of folks with questions we can't answer right now because we have not started the technical work. That's what I got for you right now. So I didn't quite leave 10 minutes for Q&A, but fine.
Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Nick. And you've really gone through what was pretty amazing transition, and you kept it going remarkably well. So, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So along the Bruce Vento line, it was a dedicated lane. And it sounds like you've already decided to put a dedicated lane if you were to do it on White Bear Avenue. But the A line on Snelling is not a dedicated lane. So are you looking at the option of not having a dedicated lane and making it more like the A line down Snelling to Ford Parkway instead of a dedicated lane, and what that would look like for servicing White Bear Avenue with maybe less cost and nice buses and other stops, and reconfiguring White Bear Avenue to do something like that instead of a dedicated lane?
Great question. The
I
fundamental
know, we
one that
can't
many
answer
people in the community have talked about, the difference between ABRT and a transit lane.
Okay.
Can you do a brief?
Yes.
I just looked at the map and saw
No,
that
sorry,
it's
no,
midway.
it's a really legitimate question.
No, it's a great question. We have 3 types of BRT in this region. Highway BRT, which is what orange and red are, and then we've got dedicated BRT, which we don't yet have physically yet. It's being built, Gold Line.
Right, right.
And then mostly arterial BRT with the ACD lines that be now in construction. No, we are looking at, as a starting point, basically sliding over the dedicated lanes that would have been in the Bruce Vento Trail corridor. But as I mentioned earlier, there are going to be challenges physically to do that, so we're going to figure out how this works. It could be center running, it might be side running, it could be business access and transit lanes, which is not an exclusive lane for bus, but shared with right turners and people accessing driveways. There's certain segments that there are definitely a lot of driveways. I think this segment just south of Larpenteur. On one side is alley loaded, so very few curb cuts. On the other side, there's mailboxes. And so even if we were to do a back lane on that side, some 6 days a week, there would be postal service running with the buses.
So lots of options.
And so we got to figure out how to make things fit.
Thank you.
The other note too is we're not just solving for our problem. This segment is the highest crash corridor in the Ramsey County roadway system. And so, safety issue.
All right, I'm gonna ask for Deb has a comment, and then Wendy, and then Reva, can you close out the meeting? Because Nick and I are about to walk out of here.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of quick comments. First of all, Councilmember Bento couldn't be here tonight, so she has sent me a message. She's listening, so she is wanting me to know what a great job that you, Craig, and Nick, and the Purple Line team has done on this project, and that she couldn't be prouder or more grateful for them for all the work that you've done. So she wanted me to relay that, and I would second that. I would also add and want to thank Ramsey County for taking a look at this project and knowing that we were having issues on how to develop it and how to make this work, and I really appreciate the foresight on looking at it a little differently. On a down note, but Nick just left, so he can't counter me. Our risks are, there is truth to the statement that our risks are somewhat limited or reduced after the last legislative session. They are not eliminated. And I think when we look at a lot of our transit projects, we need to keep considering that, because I would say by and large they have changed, but what the impacts are still somewhat unknown. So as we are still figuring those out, as we are applying our policy, learning what the new legislation does, all of those things, we need to keep that in mind and make sure that we're proceeding cautiously as well.
Thank you, Deb. I hope and I know we will continue to have updates on how our transit advancement policy is applied and the impacts of risk and how we're mitigating those risks. Thank you for that.
Madam Chair, I was
Go
supposed
ahead.
to get to talk. I just want to make sure I'm still going to get the opportunity to ask a question.
And you sure will. I'm glad that you reminded me. Go ahead, Councilmember.
Thank you. So I really appreciated Gail's question, but I wanted to flip it around a little bit. I think a lot of the cost and complexity of the project comes from that quest for federal funds by having the dedicated guideway. Has anybody even done a back of the envelope sort of calculation on what it would cost to do it as arterial BRT instead and just give up the federal funds?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Wolf. So it is partially a function of being in the federal program. As a New Starts project requires 50% dedicated guideway, which can be either exclusive or semi-exclusive. And we're looking at both. And the project that we had to the mall on the Bruce Hunter Trail Corridor was about 70%. But we've also now likely lost the back lanes that we had planned on Robert Street as a result of the city-led reconstruction of that street and wanting to go to 4 to 3. This quarter has been looked at in multiple different ways over time. There was an arterial BRT mode looked at back in that 2015-16 timeframe on White Bear. In addition, I believe White Bear was looked at in the first iteration of Network Next 2012 version as well. And part of it is we've got existing service out there today, and putting in dedicated lanes isn't just about trying to chase federal money, it's trying to provide a benefit. And so we'll be looking at where it makes sense, and we're gonna be almost forced to do that with the constraints we have on the White Bear Avenue corridors to figure out where are we improving the transit customer's life who takes the 54 today, which is a limited stop. Odds are the stops that we're gonna have for Purple Line are gonna be the exact same place as the 54 stops today. They are half-mile spaced, and that's what's required when you convert to BRT. But it's about providing better reliability and speed. And so we have to be solving a problem. Back to what Terrence mentioned earlier, we have to define, we can't be just putting in lanes. just for the sake of putting in lanes.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? If there is, okay, go ahead, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Real quick, I'm the new representative for Vadnais Heights. Can you just do a quick reminder on the timing of the different phases?
Going forward or looking back?
Yeah, just going forward. We're going forward.
Yep, absolutely. Madam Chair, Council Member, so what we're looking at here is really looking probably between now and spring, just focusing time and energy on how to get to Maplewood Mall Transit Center via White Bear Avenue. We suspect that we won't have any complete picture of what that looks like or how it could be done until about springtime of next year. We'll be coming in pieces and chunks. Like I said, we'll have stations hopefully in September. In November, we might have the 3 to 4 best ways to lay out the roadway, which would include how much of it would be dedicated and where can we put dedicated in it versus it might even be a hybrid option where there might be center running in part, could be side running in other parts. We're really got a lot of work to figure out how this is going to work. After we're able to do that, we would expect that if there's a desire to look at either the other 2 alternate endpoints north of 694, that would be the time to start looking at that. Once we can show that we have a way to get to the Maplewood Mall Transit Center and know that, then we can explore those other endpoints.
This time next year, roughly.
I would say, yeah, maybe a couple months earlier, but not by much.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig, for that presentation. That concludes your presentation. And that also concludes our meeting. So with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.